Daniel, you can start letting folks in.
Okay. Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of our course. This is session 2, but it is week 3 of our course, Early History of the African Renaissance from 1896 to the present. We had skipped a week because last week I had to go back to the States to see my brother. Well, he already graduated, but to celebrate with my brother for graduating from university. So shout out to Lamar T. Ledbetter. He graduated with his degree in psychology. So we're incredibly proud of him and what he's going to do for our community. So now we're back, and we're going to continue our discussion. And for this week, we are going to be breaking down and talking about the context around one of the most important books in this period and in African literature, Batu Allah. Batu Allah was written by Rene Maran, published in 1921. This is what we will center our course around today. This course, unlike what we did last year, where we centered every session around a particular meeting that happened in African history, this year we are focused on pieces of literature. We'll be looking at nonfiction literature as well as fiction. This is fiction, but it's based off of real life events and real life conversations. So we're going to be looking at significant pieces of literature and forming our course discussions around them. Every one of these pieces of literature will be available for you on our course website. Now, if you're a person that likes a hard copy of things, you can always get these books on Amazon or from Chapters or from Barnes & Nobles, or if you can find a good black bookstore in your area, get it from a black bookstore, support black business. But you can find these books, they're readily available, and of course the PDFs will be available on our course website. Matter of fact, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, because I want to get into this before we get into our discussion today. With this course in particular, the course website is incredibly important. So Daniel, pull that up if you can. And those of you that don't know, Daniel Roberts III is my permanent teaching assistant. Well, not permanent, he's going to go on to do great things, but he's been a teaching assistant for the past 2 years. And he just graduated from university, from Temple University, with a degree in African American Studies and Africology. So we're incredibly proud of him as well. This is the course website. This is what it looks like when you open it. The first thing that you will see are recordings of class sessions, all the way back to, I think 2021 at least, maybe 2020. But could you scroll down a little bit, Daniel, so they can see the other chapters in this course? So that's all the recordings. Then you'll see week 2 and 3. Go back up a little bit more to week 2 and 3, 2023. You will see what we're talking about this week. So in this chapter, you will find go up a little bit more and click on that first tab. There you go. This is the link to the book. You will find the book that we are going over this week if you want to read it. It's a short novel. It's about 200 pages, and it's free. It's free for you to read and to look at. In addition, underneath the book, you will also find some articles about Rene Maran that we'll talk about today. Thank you, Daniel. You can stop sharing that. Everything that we talk about in this class and in all the classes that we've had in this cycle of courses, they all have course websites. All the reading, all the evidence is there, the historical evidence, the background information. So please utilize it. It's free. It's free information. You can share it with people. This stuff is meant to be shared. All right, let's get into our discussion today. Next slide, please. What are we going to be talking about today? We're going to talk about who Rene Maran was and what was the significance of Batu Allah. We will talk about the themes present in this novel, and then we will talk about some historical examples that connect to the themes in this very important book published in 1921. A lot of well, first off, a lot of African people on the continent, in the Caribbean, in North America, are unfamiliar with this book. But at the time of its release, about 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, this was the talk of the African world. It started out as the talk of the Francophone African world, and then when it was translated into English, it became the talk of the emerging Harlem Renaissance, which was the new Negro movement, which we'll talk about next week. So, very important text. Next slide, please. This is the time period that we're up to so far in the class. We started with the battle of the victory of the Ethiopians in 1896. Today we're going to go up to about the 1930s. We're going to stop roughly about the 1930s, but we're going to talk about this time period really between 1910 and 1930, so that 20-year period. And this book was published right in the middle, 1921. So we'll cover some events that happened before 1921, and then we'll talk about the aftermath of what happened to the author as a result of him publishing this book. So it'll take us to about 1930, and then we'll pick up there next week. Next slide, please. So 1922. This is the cover of the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that civil rights organization that was founded in the United States, came out of actually the Niagara movement, which was a movement of Africans that met on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls to think about how they were going to fight against racial discrimination and racial terrorism. We're talking about lynching and those types of things in the United States. This was led by people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others. Out of that movement came the NAACP that used legal militarism, that used direct action, strikes, and all these things to fight racial discrimination. They also used the press, and they had a magazine, a publication called The Crisis, which is still in publication today. 1922, the cover of The Crisis, you have Rene Maran. This is how important he was to Africans all over the world. And his story connects Africans all over the world. Rene Maran was born in 1887 on a boat that was going from French Guiana in South America to Martinique. His father was a government worker, essentially, for the French. French Guiana and Martinique are still a part of France. They are called departments, which is just a nice name for a colony. But they're departments of France. So technically, it's France. His father was a colonial officer. He was born on a boat going to Martinique and raised a little bit in Martinique. His father then gets appointed to work in what was then called French Equatorial Africa, what's now Gabon. So his father is a black man from the Caribbean, takes his job as in part of the colonial administration in Gabon, and takes his son and his wife with him. His son eventually gets educated in private schools in France. And then he begins to write. He begins to write poetry, mostly, talking about primarily his isolation and depression he's feeling. Because you can imagine, in the late 1800s, being a black man from the Caribbean whose father is stationed in Africa, going to school in France, the type of discrimination that he faced, the type of racism that he faced, the type of cultural alienation that he faced in France at the time as a young person. He leaves school in 1909 at the age of 22 and joins the colonial service, just like his father. And he is stationed in what was then called Ubangi Shari, which now is known as the Central African Republic. Next slide, please. So at the time that he's stationed in 1909, this is what the map of Africa looks like. So he's stationed here, what they call French Equatorial Africa, which included Chad, which included what they, again, at the time was called Ubangi Shari, which is the Central African Republic. You see, it's very close to the Belgian Congo, close to Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. All this area is connected. And you have French Equatorial Africa as well, with Guinea, Gabon. So you have the French operating in this area. You also have the British, you have the Belgians, you have the Germans who controlled Cameroon at the time. So this is a mix of colonial interests as well as traditional African territories, kingdoms as such, mostly Bantu-speaking kingdoms, with the exception of what's going on in Chad and in Sudan. So this is where he's stationed in 1909. This is, again, the colonial map of Africa. The only independent space is Ethiopia. Liberia, we don't count, because Liberia was a settler colony of the United States. Next slide, please. So he's coming from, again, the Caribbean, which is under its own form of colonization, both from the British and the French, like we talked about with Guadeloupe and Martinique and French Guyana, British Jamaica, all these places, and then the growing influence of the imperial United States. After the Spanish-American War, at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. is playing much more of a larger imperial role in the Caribbean and in Latin America, Central America and South America. So this is the context that René Morin has grown up in, a colonial context, an imperial context. And we're going to talk about Haiti in 1915 a little bit later. Next slide, please. In 1921, when this book is released, it is the first book written by a black man to win the Prix Goncourt. And you know I don't speak French, so I'm probably butchering this, but the Prix Goncourt. This is the French version of the Pulitzer Prize. It was given that much acclaim. But with that acclaim also came notoriety. Because what he does in this book, he exposes French colonialism in Central Africa from the position not just as a colonial administrator, but someone that took it upon himself to speak on behalf of the African folks. So let's really break this down. You have an African brother born or a descendant of Africa. Parents are from French Guyana. He's pretty much born in Martinique, spends his first years in Martinique, travels to Central Africa, travels to Europe, and now is serving as a colonial administrator in the Central African Republic. And he's writing this book. And the audience is not just for Europeans, but also for Africans around the world. And somehow he's able to win this prize. And you would think that this sets him up for life. You know, you win a Pulitzer Prize, you win a Prix Goncourt, you should be set. We're going to talk about what happens because we have to talk about what he says in this book. Next slide, please. Themes in this book. The first theme that we can talk about, and Batu Ula is also the name of the main character of the book. Batu Ula is a chief of one of the ethnic groups in the Central African Republic. The work talks a lot about, the first thing we'll talk about are African perceptions of Europeans. This book is set around the turn of the 20th century, so the early 1900s going into the 19-teens. And it talks about the height of imperialism. This is when colonialism is at its height, and right before and during World War I. This is when many African leaders and the masses of African people are really starting to encounter Europeans on a daily basis and really getting into the heart of colonial exploitation. You know, prior to the end of the 1900s, most of Europeans were just on the coast of Africa. Right now, we're talking about the heart of Africa, right in the middle, the Central African Republic. It doesn't get any more center in Africa than that. That's why it has a name, Central African Republic. So we're talking about the heart of Africa. So these are when Europeans have made their way all the way into the interior and now are setting up shop for colonization. Well, what did Africans think about that? How did they view Europeans? How did they view the way that they operated? This book talks about it.
Is it a novel?
It's a novel. Next slide, please. I'll go on to explain that. Because what he did, and he gave interviews. René Morin gave interviews about this book and his process in writing this book. Because you have to remember, he is actually a member of the colonizing body. He's a colonial administrator. He works for the French. Now, before we get all bent out of shape and saying, well, how could he do that? How could he work for the French? This is Ottawa. Half the black people in this room work for the government. And if you work for the government, you work for the colonial administration. That's what it is. Now, we could be as radical as we want, and we're going to do exactly what René Morin did, which is critique. This is what it is. So before we start to say, oh, how could he do that? It was a job. It was his father's job. It's a job he did. It's a government job. So he's working for the colonial government, but as a black person, like so many of us in Ottawa or in DC or anywhere where black people are working for the government, we know we have two roles to play. Yeah, we got to make our money, get our salary, support our family, but we're also trying to find a way to get more freedom, to get more liberation. It's exactly what Rene Moran did. So he's a colonial administrator, but he didn't view the Africans the same way as the French, white French colonial administrators. He didn't see them as savages. He didn't see them as natives to be civilized. He said, these are black people just like me. How can I relate to them? So he says, since he arrived in the Central African Republic in 1909, he said, during that period, I studied the native the native every day. I made him speak. If I have reproduced, translated the sorrows of the natives, if I have striven to render their mentality tangible, I cannot allow that people impute to me what the natives really think and what they say when they think no one hears them. My book, the preface aside, contains none of my ideas. In it, I've only been a recording device. What is he saying? He's saying two things at once. To the French, he's saying, look, this book, I'm not telling you what I think about colonialism. This is what the Africans think about colonialism. So don't get mad at me when you read what's being said there. I'm just a recording device. But he's also letting everybody know that this is what Africans think when white people aren't around. What Africans think when there's no colonial administrator to hear them talking. And we know what that's like. Every African person that lives in a racialized situation knows what it's like, how we talk amongst ourselves versus how we talk if we're on the job or if there's a mixed company, as they say. So he's making sure he's like, this is what's really being discussed. So don't come at me, don't get mad at me when you hear what Africans really think about this colonial situation. And he says the preface aside, because he does have a beautiful preference. And this is what really got him in trouble with this book. It was the preface. His preface talks about how colonialism is not working. Now, I'm not going to say Rene Moran is a revolutionary in a sense. He's not saying completely stop French colonialism. He's saying the way we're doing French colonialism is not working. We're not doing the vaulted things that we say we're doing, civilizing and bringing technology to African people. We're not doing any of that. It's just pure exploitation. He says it's wrong. It's poor exploitation. And if the French actually care about humanity the way that the French say that they do, then we need to change the practices that we have. So he's more of a reformer than a revolutionary. He's not saying completely end colonization. That's not his position. He's saying we need to be more humane in what we are doing because what we say we are about is not what we're about. And that's not surprising. That's not surprising. This man grew up in the colonial administration. He went to private French schools, and the French are really, really good in their assimilation projects. They're really good at it. Whether we look at Africans coming from Martinique, Africans coming from Guadeloupe, Africans that were educated by the French in Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Senegal. The French made it a practice. They weren't like the British. The British colonial practice was this. You're niggers, you're savages, we're British. You will never be British people. You will never be British people. You are to be exploited, and if we decide to treat you humanely, we'll do so. The French were, oh, come, yes, if you pass the test, you can become Frenchmen just like us. If you put aside all of your culture, if you put aside all your identity, if you put aside your language, if you put aside all of this, you adopt the French language, the French culture. You learn more about French history than the French know. Of course, you adopt Christianity. You do all these things. You will be a Frenchman, and we will treat you like a Frenchman, so they say. So that assimilation process, which started young, started in the schools, it really did its job with many of the Africans under French domination. So even those Africans like Moran, who were reformers and critiquers, they never went so far as to say that we need complete independence from the French because of the brainwashing that they endured. But even with that, by him even critiquing French colonialism, he was attacked. We'll talk about what happens to him after this book comes out, but just his critique. So let's talk about the words that he put into the mouth of Batu Allah, this African chief in Central African Republic. What does Batu Allah say about white folks? Next slide, please. So let me set up the context of the book. So this book follows Batu Allah for a couple of days. A lot of things happen in this book. We have Batu Allah's private thoughts, what he's thinking about his world. You know, Moran paints a very vivid picture of Central African Republic at the time, or Abangi Shari as it's called. He talks about the wildlife. He talks about how the air smells. He talks about the grass. It's vivid. It reads like a movie. You can see the things that he's talking about. It's a brilliantly written novel. And it goes through a number of events. Hunting, the importance of hunting to this African society. It talks about rites of passage, young people becoming men and women in the society, and all the pageantry around that. And it talks about relations with the French, the colonial officers. So here's what, and I'm going to have a lot of these passages in here because I want you to see what's in the book. I'm not going to give away everything with the book because I want you to read it. But here are some things. This is particularly dealing with the theme of African perceptions of Europeans. Batu Allah's eyes were bloodshot, and he shouted and stammered. So this is at a meeting. This is actually at a party with a bunch of they're celebrating these youth that have gone through the rites of passage to become men and women, and there's a big celebration, and they're partying and everything. And then the conversation of the Europeans comes up. Just like when we have our family dinners, and folks get a little drink in them, and they feel free to talk. So this is what the chief said. He said, "The whites are good for nothing. They call us liars and treat us accordingly. Our lies don't deceive anyone. If we embellish the truth, sometimes it's because the truth isn't good enough. Manioc without salt is tasteless. But the whites, they lie for nothing. They lie with method. They lie by rote, as naturally as they breathe. That's what gives them advantage over us. They say the Negroes under one chief hate the Negroes under another chief. La la. How about the Bonjoulis? That's what they call the whites, because French people say bonjour, so that's what they call the whites, the Bonjoulis. The Long Muskets, the Montpierres, the priests, and the commandants. Do they agree? If they don't, why should we? He's saying white people don't agree. So if we have our conflicts the same way white folks have their conflicts, but no, they say that all black people have conflicts. Next slide. He's still talking about it. He said, "I will never allow anyone to deny the meanness of the whites. What I blame them for most is their lying and their cheating. The things they didn't promise us. Later on, they say, you'll see it's only for your own good that we force you to work. We take only a very, very small part of the money we make you earn. We'll use what we take to build villages for you, roads, bridges, machines that run on iron rails by means of fire. Where are they? The roads, the bridges, the wonderful machines. Where, I ask? Nowhere, not a sign of them, nothing. And so far from taking only a tiny part of what we earn, they, next slide, rob us of our last sou. Aren't we to be pitied? I ask you, aren't we to be pitied? 30 moons ago, we got 3 francs a kilo for our rubber. Overnight, the price went down. Without offering the shadow of an explanation, they paid us only 15 sous for the same quantity of banga, 1 mea and 5 bimbas. And the governor chose that very moment to raise our tax from 5 to 7 and 10 francs. Now, there isn't anybody who doesn't know that from the first day of the dry season to the last day of the rainy season, we work just to swell the taxes, if not also to fill the pockets of our commandants. Those are the French colonial officers. We're nothing but flesh to feed their taxes. We're nothing but beasts of burden. Beast, not even that. Dogs, they feed their dogs and tend their horses. We're less than their animals. We're the lowest of the low. They are killing us by slow degrees. So these are the words that Moran put into the mouth of this African chief, talking about colonization, talking about what it does, forcing Africans to work. So how colonization works, what he's talking about. Europeans say, we're going to tax you, but you can't pay us with the things that you use for currency, cowrie shells, copper bars, these things that Africans have been using as currency from time immemorial. They say, no, we don't want that. You have to get money in francs. So or pounds if it was the British. In order to get that, that means you have to work for us. So in order to pay taxes, you have to work for us. And then we control how much you make, and how much we're going to take from you. This is colonization. This is what it did. And so they're talking about rubber. This is what was being exploited in the Central African Republic, same way as in the Congo, just to the south. So the chief is saying, this is how we feel about the situation. And he's saying this to a crowd of his comrades that are at this party. Next slide. This book also talks about the changes in African society as a result of colonization. The changes that occurred in African society as a result of colonization. Again, this book talks about a rites of passage ceremony where boys become men and girls become women. And the fact that they had to hold this ceremony clandestinely on a plot of land that was actually controlled by the French governor. The governor happened to be away, so they snuck onto the land and had this ceremony. They would never have to do that if the French weren't there. They could use this open space for what it was intended to be used for. That's just one of the changes in religion, the changes in so many things. And this actually relates to historical events. Next slide. Let's go a little bit to the southeast. We'll go to Rwanda and Uganda. And this is a perfect example. Around the same time that Moran is writing and putting the words in Batu Allah's mouth, we have the story of the Nyabingi Muhamusa. Nyabingi Muhamusa. That word Nyabingi may be very familiar to those of you that listen to reggae, that know anything about Rastafari. Nyabingi chants are a key element of reggae. But this is where it comes from. The Nyabingi is actually a spirit. It's a spirit that possesses people. It's a spirit of an African queen that possesses people and fights for justice. And this spirit possessed this woman named Muhamusa, who was a queen mother in the kingdom of Rwanda. Next slide, please. So what happened? So this is where the story of this novel takes place. And now we're talking about Rwanda, which is here, and Uganda, because this story takes place, this historical event that we're talking about takes place here. This is under German and Belgian colonialism. So she's a queen mother. She is one of the wives of the king Ra Bugari. Very powerful king. He's the first king to actually encounter the Europeans. He's the king of the kingdom of Rwanda. When he dies in 1895, his throne is taken over by first his adopted son, but then that adopted son dies relatively quick. Next slide. In that process of his adopted son dying, there is a battle for the throne. Now, Muhamusa, as being one of his wives, she has a son. Her son is one of the people entitled to the throne. Now, just like many African kingdoms, it's not automatic that the oldest son is going to become the king. You know, there's a council of elders that determine who's going to get that position. So at the time, there was another queen mother who wanted to put her son on the throne. Her son by the name of Musinga. She, along with other people in the court that supported Musinga, appealed to the Germans who are now in the area. And they basically make this agreement. If you help Musinga become king of Rwanda, we will be under the protection of the Germans. We'll allow the Germans to bring missionaries in. We'll allow the Germans to set up educational facilities. And, of course, we'll get guns and arms from the Germans. The Germans agree. So the Germans back Musinga to become the next king of Rwanda. And he's done. It's a coup because he wasn't going to be the pick. He was not going to end up becoming king of Rwanda. When this happens, Muhamusa decides to leave the kingdom, because she knows her and her son are under threat by this new king that's backed by the Germans, and you see him there. And later on, the Belgians. Next slide. Yeah. This is very important for the history of Rwanda. At this time, the ruling family in Rwanda are Tutsi. Now, what that means at the time is different than what it would become. This designation of Tutsi and Hutu, these are social conditions tied to your occupation, tied to your wealth, tied to these different things. They are not racial categories at this point. Everybody speaks the same language. Everybody has the same religion. They're not racial categories at all. What the Germans and the Belgians do is very sneaky, is incredibly, it's It's diabolical what they do. Because what the Germans do, once they have their hand-picked king in place, they bring in the missionaries. They control the education system. And the Germans make it a point to ally themselves with people identified as Tutsi and say, hey, guess what? You know the Hutu people? You're a completely different race than them. You came from Hamites. You are different. You are special. You're not, Hutu, that's a completely different race. Now, at the time, this wasn't the case. This wasn't even thought about among the Africans. It was a social condition. It's like we have people that are wealthy and people that are poor. Now, if you get some wealth, some money, you become wealthy. You become part of a wealthy class. That doesn't change your race. That doesn't change your ethnicity. So that's what it was. The Germans changed all of that, and then they put it in the education system so that it became, and they rewrote history of Rwanda and made it appear as though the Tutsi race it was naturally fit to rule and naturally who was going to be in charge. This is going to have tremendous impact on what happens in Rwanda in 1994, all because of a lie that the Germans told. And it starts here. So this is what colonization does. It's not just about the taking of the land. It's not just about the taxation. It's about changing social relations in Africa that are ultimately going to lead to some of the worst horrific fighting that we see on the African continent. All the result of European interference. Next slide. So what happens? Rwanda becomes a German protectorate. Now you see him in his German clothes. So you see he's thoroughly Europeanized. You see how he's sitting there. Increased presence of European missionaries, increased exploitation by the ruling class, this Tutsi class that's supported by the Germans, who are putting into their minds that they are racially different than the Hutu, that are putting into their minds that they're a chosen people in a way. Again, complete German and Belgian fabrication, because they see the world through these racialized lenses. So they create this and propagate this. Next slide, please. So what Muhumusa does, she goes to what's now northern Rwanda, southern Uganda, and she reestablishes herself and her son. And at the same time, she joins the Mugira, which is a religious order. She becomes a priestess, and then she eventually gets possessed by the spirit of the Nyabingi. And people respect this spirit. And she talks to the people through this ancestral spirit. And she said, we have to resist the whites. Look at what they're doing in Rwanda. Look at what they're doing in Uganda. Look at what they're doing in Congo. We all have to come together, whether that's Hutu, whether that's Tutsi, whether that's Twa. We all have to come together and resist. So she collaborates with the Batwa. These are the people in Central Africa that the Europeans would call pygmies. These are short-statured African people that are masters of the rainforest. So she collaborates with them. She forms this united front against European imperialism. And they fight hard because they believe in her. And she's leading these forces. She's captured by the Germans. And they try to put her on house arrest, but she escapes and continues to fight. It takes a united British and German effort to finally capture her in 1911 and then imprison her in Uganda, where she passes away in 1944. But not before a very spirited resistance to the Europeans. So this is a name that you should know. This is a name that you should know. And that Nyabingi spirit would go from her to other rebel fighters and continue to jump to different people and continue to inspire the people to fight against European colonization. Next slide, please. So that's just one example of what the European presence did in terms of social relations in Africa, creating new social categories, making existing social categories, because Tutsi and Hutu existed before the Europeans came, but again, they were social categories. People could go in between the two depending on your circumstance. It was not a racialized thing. And creating this divide that would come back to haunt Africa. This wasn't just done here. The changes in African society included changes in gender relations, changes in religious practices, changes in educational practices. All of this are the more lasting results of colonization. Once the taxation ended, once the Europeans were off the land, that's one thing, but just so hard to change the mind and the soul of African people affected by colonization. The belief that Europe was superior, that the French had a superior culture, that the British had a superior culture, that we should dress like Europeans, that we should form our laws like Europeans, that we should have our educational systems like Europeans. All of these are the more lasting effects that we're still fighting to decolonize the curriculums, to decolonize the political systems in Africa. Colonization ended pretty much in 1994 when apartheid ended in South Africa. We can say that's the formal end of colonization in Africa. However, these mental enslavement of many of us, it still continues. And this is where it starts on the continent. This is where it starts. So before we get into colonial police and military forces, let's take a break. I'll open it up to any questions, and then we'll get back into it. So, Daniel, anything in the chat, or are there any hands that are raised?
There's nothing in the chat, and I don't see any hands. David, go ahead.
Good morning. In line with what you were saying, Dr. Ledbetter, the conditioning that colonization has had on the various groups, as you said, it's still going on today. Would you say that because the colonizers deliberately changed the language or forced their language onto the individuals, like we have pretty much here in Canada, and changed the culture and forced the culture like they are doing pretty much here in Canada, but that is still continuing, and that reinforcement of the Eurocentric viewpoint being the superior culture over all other cultures around the globe? Would you say that is still continuing?
Yes.
As we're seeing evidence here pretty much in Canada.
Yeah, very much so. And it's not just in Canada. I mean, we can look right on the continent. You know, we have the African Union has 5 official languages: English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and Swahili. Only one of those is an African language. We got situations like what's happening in Cameroon, where there's political issues around it, but people are fighting over 2 European languages. You got situations like the Gambia and Senegal. The Gambia shouldn't exist. It's a little tiny colonial creation by the British. But they couldn't unite in the 1980s because they couldn't figure out the language policy. Language is key. One of the most profound things that was ever said to me, I was in graduate school. I was in Philadelphia, and I was at a meeting, actually, of the Marcus Garvey's organization, the UNI. I'm not that old. I wasn't with when Marcus Garvey was alive, but this is the organization continues. So when we were at a meeting, it was a Sunday, and there was a presenter, and the presenter said something that really stuck with me, and it stuck with me since, and this was 15 years ago. The presenter said, we're so colonized that we dream in the language of our oppressors. Just let that sink in for a second. We dream in English and in French, and many of us, some of us don't, a lot of us don't, but many of us that are on this call, we do. That's how profound it is. We can't even speak to one another, and we can't even pass down our histories in the languages that our ancestors spoke. It's one of the tremendous impacts of colonization, and one that we're still dealing with, and that impacts everything else: the educational system, our values, what we value, what we hold dear, how we want our communities to be set up, our gender relations, how we relate to each other, and men and women and everything, all of that, how we relate to nature. All of that has been influenced by colonization. And that decolonial process, that process of decolonizing ourselves, is what we have to go through and what we have to fight for. So yeah, language is key to that entire process. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Ledbetter, and as usual, always very fascinating, your presentation. In his book, Back to Order, René Morin wrote about the way Africans perceive Europeans. Why then, in spite of his observation, and I'm sure he must have preached it to the audience, Why have they continued to believe the lies that were perpetrated by Europeans to the extent that one group of people from the same country violently opposed the other? I'm talking about the Hutu and the Tutsi. Wasn't it clear to them, just as it was to René Morin, what was happening to them by the Europeans?
That's a good question. It only takes one generation to confuse things to that point till you get to that type of explosion. What you have is and then we can never forget the fact that you have a minority of African people that are completely fine with this because they benefit from it. So you never forget about that class of people. Musinga and his mother and those folks that overthrew the monarchy in Rwanda and set themselves up as the monarchy in Rwanda, they benefited from that collaboration with the Germans. So you have those Africans too. So what you have in effect, when you let the Germans and then later on the Belgians control the education system, they control the history. So you have a generation of people that grow up, that go to school, and not just school, but also church. If you really want to get into this book by Timothy Logman, Christianity and the Genocide in Rwanda. Christianity and the Genocide in Rwanda. It talks about the role played by the church who controlled the education system. If you can control the education, you can control the future. This is why I have a group of young people in this room right now. You can't see them, but there are about half a dozen young people that are working on an African history project because we have to be able to train our youth to actually know the history. Because if you don't know and you let someone else tell you, they will reconstruct your past and then control your future. So by the Germans and the Belgians controlling the education system, particularly for the elite and the people that were going to end up running things after colonization and telling them that, yeah, the Tutsi, they came from somewhere else. They came in with their cattle and they were able to take over because they're racially superior to Hutu people and it's completely different races and it's always been like that and it always will be and this is what it is and you're destined to rule and they're not. By putting that into the curriculum, into the official history, using court historians that were on the side of Musinga to rewrite Rwanda history and make that the official version, if you don't know anything else and you're not taught anything else and you believe it, then when you come to power, you're going to act off of those beliefs. And this is what we saw. So to answer your question, that's the power of these things. When you have the spiritual institutions connected with the educational institutions, it's hard to divest these beliefs out of people that grew up thinking that this is the truth because it's sanctioned by the church, it's sanctioned by what I'm learning in school. This has a deep connection to us here in Ottawa because a lot of the folks that did this work, setting up this myth and setting up these education systems throughout Africa, they're honored right down the street from where I'm speaking. I'm right in Vanier. I'm on Montreal Road. If you go a few streets up, there's a street called Pierre Blanc's, or White Father Street. Goes up the hill to a library here in Vanier. That street, that library, I think it used to be a monastery or a convent. It's connected to this group of missionaries called the White Fathers. I mean, they're very explicit, even in their name. They're telling you exactly who they are. We're the White Fathers. We are the white people that are going to tell you what civilization is and tell you about God. They came to Africa. Many of them came from Canada, financed by Germany and the Belgians and the French, coming to Africa to spread this gospel of colonialism, the gospel of white supremacy, and all of that in Africa, and caused this much damage. So this book, again, Christianity, Genocide in Rwanda, is key to understanding a lot of that. And it's not just in Rwanda, it's these other places as well, where you have this collaboration between the colonial administrator, the educational folks, the missionaries, all collaborating to create and solidify white supremacy, to make colonization appear to be natural, make colonization appear to be good. So it's hard to break these things. That's why we're still fighting in 2023 to break these ideas. Because many of our education systems, unfortunately, are still colonial. We're still promoting these ideas. Robin, go ahead.
I don't know what you just said. So why did so how do you win the award? Explain that to me. How they giving awards? That is excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling us how we're killing you niggas.
In France at the time, you had a very prominent split between the quote unquote liberal whites and the right-wing whites in France. At the time, the people that gave the award were part of the liberal whites. So they're seeing this and they're like, yeah, talk about it. So, because again, Maron didn't go so far as to say French colonialism should end. Maron said we have to do colonialism in a more civilized way. What we're doing is not right. Because he still, again, this is the power of the propaganda, the power of the education system. He still believed that what these folks were representing wasn't truly France. For him, France was the France of the French Revolution, the France of the rights of man, and all of these high ideals. So he couldn't possibly think that a true France would commit these atrocities. This is just a fringe version of France. It's just like those folks that say, yeah, America's not bad. It's just that we got to get the Trump people out because, these are the true values of America. No, it's corrupted from the inside out. But that's a different discussion from a different time. But that's why he won the award. But he was attacked by the right wing immediately when this came out. The fact that he would dare bite, and they wrote this in the French press, how dare you bite the hand that feeds you? You're a colonial administrator. We educated you. You went to private French schools. How dare you write this? And at the end of this, I'm going to talk about what happens to them. But yes, that's kind of what happened. Daniel, anything in the chat? Any other questions?
Unless Robin has another question, there's nothing else in the chat or in the...
Okay, let's get back into it then. Good. The next theme that this book brings up, one of the other themes that the book brings up, are the presence of colonial police and military forces in the colonies in Africa. Now, it's really important to point this out. Colonization, when we think about it, particularly in this part of Africa, in Central Africa, in parts of West Africa, you're not seeing tens of thousands of white French troops going into Africa and taking over. That's not how these things happen. The colonial police forces and the colonial military forces were oftentimes other African people with white commanders, of course, because black people can't command themselves according to the colonization. But many of the forces were other Africans. In West Africa, the West African Rifles, the British West African Rifles, a lot of these were Africans from Jamaica, Africans from other parts of the British West Indies, Africans that had fought alongside the colonizers in various wars, and then they were sent to put down revolts in Ghana, in Nigeria, in other places. The French did the same thing. But you might be asking yourself in 2023, why would somebody join a colonial police force or a colonial military operation? Same reason why black people join the police and the military in Canada. It's a job. It's a job. That's how it was looked. That's how we look at it now. That's how they looked at it then. This is a job. And these are the people that are paying me. So this is what I'm going to do. So don't be too hard on these people if we look at the situation today. This is what it was. This is the mentality. So the book brings that out. Let's talk about what's actually said in the text. Next slide. One of the sub-themes in this book, because it's not just a book where the chief is going off on colonization for 200 pages. It's also some very juicy stuff that happens. And Batu Allah has, I think, 9 wives. So Batu Allah has 9 wives, and one of them is his favorite. It's his nice young wife, and he's older at the time. He's middle-aged. Here's this nice young wife who's also in love with a nice young man that's in the neighborhood. The nice young man's name is I think it's Basingu. So they sneak away right before this big hunting expedition. They sneak away. So you have one of the wives of Batu Allah and this young man who's very handsome, very single. He gets around with all the ladies. In fact, there's a very interesting scene in this book where Batu Allah's wives are talking amongst themselves, and there's no men around, and there are also some other women, and the women are having a conversation, and they're talking about how fine this young man is, and how he's messing with all these women behind their husbands' backs. And the two of the wives of Batu Allah are jealous of each other because they feel they both want the affections of this young man who's not their husband. And the younger wife, she actually makes this comment. She says, because one of the older wives is trying to talk down about this guy because she really wants him. And she's saying that, oh, you know, he probably has a disease. He's messed with all these women, and I would never want him. And the young wife makes a comment. She says, it's only the people that can't get what they want to eat to say that they're not hungry. You couldn't get them anyway. So that's why you talk about you don't want them, because only the people that can't get what they want to eat to say that they're not hungry. So I just love that line in the book. But anyway, this is him talking. And they're afraid because at the party that I previously talked about, where the rites of passage happened and everybody was partying, they get caught dancing with each other, and it's real suggestive, and Batu Allah kind of snaps, and he's about to attack both of them. So they know that their days are numbered because he realizes that they're probably messing around. So she's trying to convince him to escape with her, to leave and go somewhere else. So they're talking it over, and she wants him to become a police officer, a colonial police officer. So he says, Yasin Gunjia, what you have said is right. I must think it over. But I swear to you, by Ngakora, which is God, that you will be safe. This is not the time to run away. Wait until the chase is over. This is the hunt. Then I'll go to Bengui to enter the service. Torugu, which is a colonial police officer, carries a musket, cartridges, and a big knife fastened on the left side to a leather belt. He is well dressed. He wears a chichilla and sandals, and he receives pay. And every Sunday, when the tatalita, euphoric for the blowing of the horn, has sounded, dismissed, he can go and make his little pendera in the villages where the women admire him. And this is not all. There are other advantages besides. Instead of paying taxes, we Torugus help to collect them by pillaging the villages, both the villages that still have the taxes to pay and those that have already paid. We make the villagers pound the rubber. We gather in the recruits for carrying the sandukos. That's what a Torugu has to do. Wherever we go to the chiefs and, next slide, and their men to secure our goodwill, they heap us with presents. These little privileges make the life of a Torugu pleasant, easy, enjoyable, especially as the commandants don't know the language of the country well, our country, our language. So supposing a certain village hasn't been generous with gifts, what do? We invent one of those delightful stories which have neither head nor tail, and we tell it to the excellent commandant. Sensible, clear-sighted man begins by imprisoning the entire population: chickens, chiefs, children, dogs, women, goats, slaves, crops. Then the chickens, goats, dogs, crops, and women are sometimes auctioned off, and the money so obtained swells the taxes. Occasionally, the goats and chickens are distributed among friends, that is, if they are not presented to the governor, who will remember the courtesy when the time comes for promotion. This is why he wants to become a cop, so that he could exploit other African people. Well, the first reason is so that he and this woman could run away from Batu Allah and live their lives out. But he wants the privilege of helping collect the taxes. He wants the privilege of exploiting the people, of raiding populations and forcing people to give him money. It's thuggery, but under a badge, under a colonial badge. So this is why and this is the mentality of many of the folks that became colonial police officers and joined the colonial military forces. So this is what Rene Moran is writing in this book. He's putting these words in the mouths of these characters to show what's really going on in Africa, also in the Caribbean. Because next slide. We can see this primarily at the same time that he's writing this. It's the same time in 1915 that the United States invades Haiti. 1915, the United States invades Haiti. The United States uses the pretext of political turmoil in Haiti. Next slide, please. Between 1911 and 1915, Haiti goes to 7 heads of state. 7 heads of state in 4 years. A lot of it has to do with outside manipulation, but the United States uses this turmoil to say that, you know what, Haitians, just like other black people around the world, they can't govern themselves. Therefore, we should invade Haiti and take over. Now, this line should sound very familiar to anyone who studied African or Caribbean or Latin American politics in the 20th century. This whole pretext that black people, brown people, yellow people, because they're having some political problems, they can't govern themselves, therefore we need to come in and take over. This is what we saw in Somalia in the 1990s. This is what we see in Congo. This is what we saw in Haiti now, what we're seeing in Haiti right now. This idea that there has to be international intervention, Western guidance, because black people can't control their politics. Meanwhile, the United States had just got done fighting a civil war between 1861 and 1865 that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. But nobody intervened. Nobody said America. And then this is all going at the same time that Europe is fighting World War I, the great European tribal war. But nobody is saying Europeans can't govern themselves. But anyway, the United States invades Haiti in 1915 in order to, quote unquote, restore democracy. Next slide. When they do, the Haitians put up fierce resistance because Haiti, among all things else, even if they're fighting amongst each other, since 1804, Haiti has valued her independence. You're not, especially if you're white, you're not going to come here and try to take over again. We kicked the French out. We fought the Spanish. We fought the British. We will fight you to maintain our independence. So the Haitians rose up and they fought. And they fought hard against the Marines. But the Marines also recruited other Haitians to join the police and military force to fight against other Haitian people. So exactly what you see happening in Africa is also happening in Haiti at the same time. Americans can't win, they can't fight against the Haitians, so they recruit other Haitians to fight against them. Next slide, please. In the process, they kill Charlemagne Perrault, one of the great heroes of Haitian resistance. This man was a guerrilla fighter, he was an organizer, he was a politician, and when the Americans kill him, they rely on a snitch. They rely on a sellout that told where his location was, and they promoted that sellout. And then when they killed him, they put his body on display and took pictures of it, thinking that this was going to scare the rest of the Haitian population into submission. It did the exact opposite. The Haitian people fought harder because they saw him as a martyr. They saw his death. And this is actually the photograph that the Americans took of his body. The Haitian people looked at this and they said, no, look how he's positioned. He's positioned almost like a dead Christ. This is a symbol, it's going to be a symbol of our revolution. And they continued to fight the Americans until the Americans left in 1935. So 20 years of U.S. occupation in Haiti. This is all happening at the same time of colonization in Africa, where the U.S. decided that we wanted to control the banking industry in Haiti. We wanted to control the natural resources of Haiti. We want to make sure that Haiti continues to be destabilized so we can't have this symbol of black independence. We want to crush Haiti. But the Haitian people fought. Haitian women, Haitian men, they fought. They formed the Cacals, the revolutionary army that fought against the Americans. So he is a symbol. And again, Europeans don't understand the African mentality, even that mentality of Africans in diaspora. You can kill the physical body, but that spirit of resistance, that lives on. That inspires people to continue to fight. So in the resistance of Haiti, even that continues today as Haiti rights itself. And Haiti will right itself. We will. I mean, this African people, we will win. That's why it's called the period of the African Renaissance. We're in the middle of it. So that was key. So this is what was going on in Haiti at the same time that you had these colonial military forces being raised in Africa. So a lot of times when we talk about why isn't Africa free? Why isn't Africa liberated? What's going on? It's because we have people that find it expedient for personal reasons, because they can't make any money any other way, or maybe they actually feel a sense of quote-unquote duty, that join these forces, police forces, military forces, and they might not think that what they're doing is stunting the African revolution, but in effect that they are. So that's what we see here. Next slide, please. The last theme that's discussed in this book is one of the key elements of colonization. One we actually already touched on is forced labor. In all of these colonial enterprises, the Europeans forced Africans to get resources, to create infrastructure, all for the benefit of Europeans. Again, just like Batu Allah said, none of these promises that were made to bring technology on us, none of this was for African people. It was all for European profit. Forced labor was a key aspect of that. Next slide. An example, 1 in 1,000. So this is Batu Allah again, talking about Europeans. Under the pretext of getting the tax that way, they forced all the Negroes they thought made good teams to transport tremendous loads. The journeys lasted 3 or 4 days. Little cared what the Sangusus weighed. These are the big things that the Europeans, so before the trains were built in Africa, before the roads were built, the Europeans made Africans, porters, they called them porters, carry all the tools and all the things. And even the Europeans themselves, they would sit on these chairs and the Africans would carry them through the bush, carry them over the mountains, carry the goods as pack animals, essentially. This is what we had. What difference did the rain or the heat make to them? They did not suffer. What if the hardships from weather and the insect pests fell upon the Negroes? The whites were undercover. Do you not understand now? He's talking about the exploitation, the forced labor, slavery inside of Africa. Because we think, oh, well, slavery and colonization, those are two different things. No, slavery is just the exploitation of African labor in the Americas. Colonization is just exploitation of African labor in Africa. It's the same thing. It's part and parcel of the same project of domination of African people. They're related. So when we talk about the Caribbean and North America and Africa and Africans all over the world, it's all a part of the same process, exploiting African labor and African resources. So this is a key element of this book. Africans were forced to pay a tax to Europeans. Europeans only took tax in European currency, so they forced Africans to work to get the European currency to pay taxes back to the European. That's how sick this process is. And if you resist it, then they suck those colonial police forces and military forces on you for resisting. This is how colonization works. And then when independence comes, the people that take over the colonial project, because of that other theme that we talk about, the changes in African social relations, the people that take over these states when independence comes, many of them just keep the process going. They keep the process going. The faces change from European governors to African governors, but the police forces are the same, the military forces are the same, and the goal is the same. Exploit African labor, exploit African resources for the benefit of a small group of African people that may have got a little bit larger because the colonization ended, so you get a little bit more black people with a little bit more money, but ultimately for the benefit of France, Belgium, Germany, Britain, United States, Canada, so on and so forth. Show an example of this in the true history. And every example I show also has the resistance. Next slide. Sorry, there's more quotes from Batu Allah. I forgot about this. In addition to forced labor, at the time that this book was written, the Europeans were fighting their first great tribal war, World War I. So the exploitation increases because France, Germany, Britain, they want to get as many resources and as many men from the colonies that they can for their own tribalism. So when the German tribe is fighting the French tribe, or fighting the Slovaks, or fighting all these people, fighting over Europe, Russians, these are all tribes. When they're fighting their horrible tribalism, you know, that's why it's called the Great War. Nobody died this much in human history. They didn't think it was going to be a part 2. That's why before it was called World War I, it was just called the Great War, because they thought it was so horrific that it would never happen again. It only took a mere 20 years later for European tribalism to jump up again. But anyway, Batu Allah says something very profound. He says, war and savagery were one and the same thing. No, he says, all men are brothers. It was wrong to steal and fight with one's neighbor. War and savagery were one and the same thing. But the whites actually compelled the blacks to take part in their savagery, to go kill for them in the Palivars in faraway lands. And if a black protested, they put a rope around his throat, whipped him, knotted him with whips, and threw him in prison. March, dirty nigger, march, die like a dog. This is what we saw in World War I. The French recruited Africans in Senegal, Central African Republic, all over French Africa to fight in their tribal wars, to die on those front lines. We valorized the Africans that fought for the United States and fought for Canada, again, doing the worst jobs and put on the front lines, cannon fodder during the European tribalism. All of this is key. But at least we can say in Canada, in the United States, those Africans volunteered to go fight because their thinking was, well, if we show the Europeans that we can fight, maybe we'll get some better treatment in Canada and the United States. Wrong. You come back, you're still getting lynched. They actually lynch African men in their uniforms to show that, yeah, you went and go fight, but you're still a nigger. But at least they volunteered. In Africa, they were conscripted. You had to go fight for the colonizer. And Africans resisted. Next slide. One of the main areas of resistance was in Kenya, with a great woman, we talked about her in our Shebros class, Mikatalili Wamenza. During World War I, the British were attempting to increase the exploitation of Africans in the part of Kenya that she lived in. She's a member of the Giriama ethnic group. So as the British are forcing the Africans to pay more taxes, recruiting young black men to fight, not necessarily in Europe for the British, but also to fight the Germans in East Africa, because that was also another theater of war in World War I, was German East Africa, because Germany loses our colonies, like Rwanda, like Burundi, Togo, and Cameroon. Germany loses those colonies, Namibia as well, after World War I. So the colonial administrators are trying to exploit her region. She, along with other women, start organizing and fighting and resisting colonization. Next slide. Her weapons of struggle, spirituality. She tells the people, go back to our ancestors, what they believed, and let's fight against what the Europeans want us to do. She made the people take oaths that they wouldn't betray the revolution, that they swear on their ancestors and the future children to be born, that they would not cooperate with colonization. Oaths are a very popular part of African resistance, both in the diaspora as well as on the continent. You have to take an oath to say that you will not betray the revolution. We need some more oaths now, and nowadays, 2023. She used dance as resistance. We know the power of music and dance to African people. Dance was also symbolic. The dances that she did with the other women in the community, they were funeral dances, but they were also dances that inspired people to reconnect with their ancestors and give them the fortitude to fight to resist colonization. She used orality. She gave speeches, not only to the people, but to the colonizers themselves, to say that we will not cooperate. We're not going to pay the taxes anymore. We're not going to let you draft our men into your army, our young men into your armies. And she gave these speeches. And again, just general non-cooperation with the authorities. You know, there's a great story of what she did. Go to the next slide. Let me see if I have it on this slide. No, go back 2 slides. Sorry about that. One more. This statue of her in Kenya. You see her with these chickens. You may say, what's the significance of these chickens? Well, part of her orality, she met with the colonial administrator. His name was Champion. That's his last name. He's a British colonial guy named Champion. And she says, we're not giving you our children anymore for your war, and we're not going to cooperate. We're not going to pay the taxes. And she said, and I'm going to show you an illustration. She had a hen with some chicks. And she told the colonial officer, she said, try to take one of those chicks from this mother hen and see what happens. So he reached down and tried to take the chick, and the mother hen attacked him, scratched him up and everything. And she said, you see that? How that hen protected her chicks? That's how we women will protect our young men and will not let you put them in the army. Well, the colonial administrator thought he was a tough guy, so he took out his pistol and he shot the hen. Well, then Mikatalili Wamenza jumps up and slaps him. Now, in the colonial record, they don't have no reason to lie about this, but they say that she slapped him so hard that he became like his equilibrium lost. She probably gave him a concussion. And then a whole melee breaks out and fighting, and then the Europeans start shooting folks and everything. They eventually arrest her, but she breaks out of prison, makes her way back into the community, and continues her non-cooperation struggle. She's ultimately arrested again, but then she's released. And she passes away, because by the time she's doing all this, she's already in her 70s. She's already in her 70s. This is the power of our elders in our community, and people that know the traditions and know how to mobilize folks. And she ultimately passed away in 1924, but not before she's successful in her resistance, non-cooperation against the British colonial forces. So all that to say, this is just an historical example of the resistance against these type of activities. So all of this, next slide, and then one more. So all of this was written in this book. He wins the prize in 1921. It makes black people around the world, by the time we get to 1922, it has inspired the new Negro movement. These Africans in the United States, based out of Harlem primarily, that's why it's called the Harlem Renaissance, who want to reconnect with Africa. They're inspired by this book. Francophone writers in Senegal, in Martinique, in French Guiana, in Guadeloupe, and other places, in French-speaking African world, are inspired. And they take away from this book, this is the anti-colonial message that we need. This is the vision of Africa, because prior to this, everything that was written by Africa was written by Europeans from the perspective of Europeans. So this is a book written by, an African descendant, but who's writing from the perspective of African people. It is an Afrocentric text. That's why he said in his preference, I'm just recording what's being said. I'm writing this from the perspective of African people. So this makes tremendous headway in black literary circles around the world. However, the French, after they're given this reward, the French right takes over politics and a lot of things. He's taken out of his colonial position as a colonial administrator. He ends up living in poverty in France, writing to African Americans like Hubert Harrison, soliciting funds for projects and just for living expenses, which they do because they're so proud of what he's done. He's supported by Africans. So even though the Europeans tried to punish him, take away his job, that he had worked, he'd been there since 1909, working as a colonial administrator. They put him in a position where he can't get another government job. But black people support him. He ends up passing away in 1960, I believe, 60, I think. But he continues to write poetry, books of poetry, other essays. Black folks in the literary circles in Paris honor him. Leopold Senghor, and Leon Demas, and Ami Césaire, another Martinican, these founders of Negritude, sing his praises for presenting this book and starting the Francophone African literary tradition with what he does. So he goes on, but he's ultimately, though, after a few generations, a lot of it is forgotten. Most English speakers don't even know about this book, even though it's been published in English and you can find it. A lot of people don't know about it. So it's important for classes like this to make sure that this story is told. The significance of this book is never forgotten. The significance of René Morin, an African descendant from French Guyanese parents, grew up, spent some time in Martinique, goes to Gabon, works in the colonial government like so many of us work in colonial governments. But yet we see the condition of our people and we're willing to speak out against it. We're willing to put the experiences of our brothers and sisters on paper or now online or in all this media so that we can expose the truth. So very prominent, very important book. Next week, we will pick up, next slide please, we will read, and this is not available on the course website, it'll be available tomorrow. I have to put the PDF up either tomorrow or Monday. We will read and talk about a speech, an article written by Fumilayo Ransome Kuti, who you may know more famously as the mother of Fela Kuti, but she was an activist, an organizer, a politician in her own right. And we're going to read the article that she wrote, We Had Equality Till Britain Came, published in 1947. So we're going to talk about the time period between the 1930s and the end of the 1940s, going into the 1950s next week. Focused on this article, we're going to talk a lot about women's activism during this time, both on the continent and the diaspora, all building this image of the African Renaissance, 1896 to the present. So that's what we'll pick up next week. You'll see the reading either tomorrow or Monday once I'm able to scan it and put it up. So read it, be ready to talk about it, and we'll go from there. So we'll open it up now for any questions or comments or announcements or anything like that. Daniel, anything in the chat? Any questions? Any hands?
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm forced to ask the question. Does theologians do history as part of their curriculum,